So basically, by November of 1776, we're not doing so well. Let's just be honest. We were getting defeated at a whole bunch of forts and everywhere else. So we're going to start fleeing south from especially the New York area. We realize that we're not doing so well and it's necessary for us to try to retreat, to regroup. Morale was very, very low. People started deserting. They just started walking away from the middle of battle. Or as they were marching towards the next battle, they would just, sit down, tie their shoe or whatever in the middle of the woods and oops, quote, get lost and not really be lost, just decide that they weren't going to fight this anymore. And so basically it gets to the point where it looked like the Continental Army might completely cease to exist, right? It was completely crumbling all the way around Washington. Even his officers thought that the Continental Army probably would not make it to the new year. On Christmas night of 1776, however, a valiant effort by a strapping George Washington is going to kind of breathe some inspiration back into the Army's efforts. He is going to lead 2,400 troops across the Delaware River in a surprise counterattack and defeat Hessian forces in Trenton, New Jersey. This Battle of Trenton is one of the two most important battles, I argue, and you can certainly disagree. But he is going to push all the way. He's going to defeat the Hessians, which we already said were the Germans recruited to fight for the British. And he's going to get bogged down for a little while, but after this, he's going to be able to push the British back and also cause them to have heavy losses at Princeton. So basically, this is the first time in the war effort so far that Washington has managed to have a sizable and relatively effective offensive against the British. And this is really going to make the morale much higher within the Continental Army. It had little strategic importance, right? There really wasn't a lot like, oh, he gained this important fort or he gained this important waterway. No, it really didn't do any of that. But what it did is it showed Washington that, it basically taught Washington how to wage an effective war against the British. If he wanted to win against the British, he needed to try to avoid direct confrontation with them at this point until they had gotten a little bit more, fighting under their belt and established. And he needed to try to use like sneak tactics, and he needed to go after the Hessians instead. These types of different things. And so that's pretty brave and heroic because it actually is a vital lesson to learn. And here you see him, gallantly going across this frozen river, and you hear all these stories. There's all these stories about the dude's feet were getting not Washington, but his soldiers' feet were getting frostbitten, and so they had to tie all these cloths over their shoes just so they didn't lose toes, and all the dramas that you could possibly imagine. But the crossing of the Delaware is obviously one of those key moments where we finally look like we kind of have a vague idea of what we're doing. Um, the Northern campaigns of 1777, then, we've kind of learned some lessons, and so you're going to have, again, Washington and his officers being relatively more inspired, more focused, and so by 1777, we had managed to stop Howe from heading north, further north anyways, and the British forces from Canada were stopped by our resistance at Lake Champlain. And so we're going to manage all those British forces. Remember, we talked about how they had created with the Quebec Act of the Intolerable Acts, there were these temporary British governments up north in Canada ready to come down and strike. Here, they come down and try to strike, and we're able to defeat them. So that's really good on our part. And so what's going to happen is the British are going to realize, all right, now it's time that we change up some of our war strategies. So in 1777, the British are going to they're going to retry the strategy of sending like 8,000 British and German troops from Canada. They're just going to keep trying to do these things, and they're just going to lose. And so they have to go back to the drawing board, and they're going to have some successes here or there, but ultimately, it's going to force the new general, General John Burgoyne, from Canada, and then also still Howe, to try to find more creative ways to move their troops en masse and not get themselves defeated by the colonists. Nonetheless, it's not going to be super successful. Fort Ticonderoga is going to fall on July 6th. and Lake George is going to bog down some of the army. And so basically, you have the British by 1777, they're starting to get themselves somewhat routed. Now, we do lose a couple more battles, particularly Patriot forces under General Horatio Gates. It is going to have a couple of defeats. But ultimately, the next huge battle is going to be at Saratoga. And at Saratoga, once again, we have the British first, the colonial forces. And the British are going to get surrounded by Patriot forces to the point where he has to surrender. And not just him, but 6,000 British to a much smaller, I argue, a much smaller Patriot force. So, between Trenton and Saratoga, these are the two most important battles because they show, yeah, you know what? We're a group of little colonists breaking away. What do we know? Well, apparently we know a little bit, at least, on how to fight because these are two huge battles for us that are victories that put us on the offensive, that managed to get a considerable British force to surrender. So these are both Trenton and Saratoga, very, very common on the AP test. And just here, your battlefield maps, if you like those, enjoy. Right? The Americans are the blue. Right there, a couple guys there. Hessians. And then the British. And it's all flanking and maneuvering, and you would never have to, on the AP test, summarize how that happened, how explain this troops flanking maneuvers or whatever. But do understand that it would be common to say, looking at this battlefield and knowing what you know about the Battle of Saratoga, what was one of the important impacts of this battle of the Revolution? Something like that. And then you would respond with something along the lines of, it allowed the American forces to be on the offensive, increasing our morale, and causing a considerable number of British soldiers to surrender. Again, Northern campaigns in 1777. There are, following Saratoga, several British victories. I list them out for you there, but again, specific dates and stuff like that, not as huge of a deal on the AP test. These series of victories, however, are important because although basically what happens is we get a little cocky. Okay, we won at Saratoga and we're like, yeah, we did good hurting you, Britain. And so it's going to kind of force us to slack off a bit. And obviously what's going to happen is the British are going to take advantage of this. We're going to flee to the town of York. And the British are going to go to Philadelphia. There's a little bit of a pause here to regroup. And then this is where we get bogged down at Valley Forge in the winter. And the British are going to take advantage of this. They're going to flank us so we can't move. Valley Forge is going to run low on supplies. All these types of things that, I mean, this is kind of legendary. You've probably heard all about Valley Forge and Washington and his men, having to eat the dirt that they could find because there was nothing else that they could cook. They would eat mice, for example. It was just not a happy time, the winter here, let's just say. So the British are going to win a lot of victories. Our morale is starting to dip again. Yeah, we've got Saratoga. Yeah, we've got Trenton. Now we're sitting here with frostbite eating our toes. Not really, but you get the idea that it's just not a good time for the Americans during this. And so what's going to happen is really this depressing era of the Revolution was when both sides really looked at their strategies and said, you know what? We're not doing a good job. Neither side really considered themselves to be quote, the winners at this point. Because really it was almost a draw. The British had come into this war thinking they were going to defeat us, no problem. And we went into this war thinking, we're so angry, we're going to defeat them, no problem. But now there's been problems. So now the question becomes, how do we face these problems? Well, let's just make it even more complicated. Let's throw in all their allies. Let's go further south. Let's toss in the Spanish, right? It's very important to remember that this wasn't just Northern patriots fighting a couple of British dudes, right? So France and Spain, where do these guys jump in? Well, during the first 2 years of fighting, Americans had actually paid for a lot of the war from loans from France and Spain. They had just given us some money. We've already kind of touched on why. France was bitter at England and Spain was mad at England because of their trade getting disrupted. So both of them were kind of more than willing to go ahead and bankroll our efforts. to continue this, as well as to kind of maintain peace and try to make the French come and help us militarily, we're going to send an emissary over to Paris to try to sit down and negotiate some form of agreement. And we send this dude named Ben Franklin, because we're like, dude, the guy likes kites, and the French like kites. They'll probably get along well. That's sarcastic. Don't write that down. So Benjamin Franklin goes over, and he's actually he's a great statesman. Say what you will about Franklin, he was very good at diplomacy. And so he is going to be successful in negotiating with the French to get them to recognize us as independent. So the French jump on board this whole, hey, we kind of like their Declaration of Independence. That's kind of cool. All right, how about we help these dudes out? If we can help them to get their independence, then America is going to be financially dependent on us. They're going to kind of owe us. So there was a little bit of quid pro quo going on here. And this is really going to upset England even more, because at this point, it was England versus America and very little European effort. But when France signs what's called the Treaty of Alliance with us, England loses it. They're like, what are you doing? This is our colonies. Why are you getting involved in our colonial efforts? That would be like if we went over to one of your colonies and decided we were going to help them break free of you. So you can kind of see why the English would be mad. You know, they didn't think the French had any place in it. However, it was strategically important for the Americans to get the French in. The Treaty of Alliance does a bunch of things. One thing, it said that France was going to help us out financially, militarily, as need be. The French were going to be involved. It also said that neither America nor France would enter into a treaty with Britain without consenting the other. So they kind of were going to work together. They were going to be viewed as equals. France guaranteed that the U.S., all of the northern parts of America and other conquests gained by the war. So when the war is done, we were going to get a sizable chunk of land. In exchange, we were going to give the French some land. The British Islands and the West Indies, particularly, eventually New Orleans comes into the mix a little bit, all this area. But basically, we kind of took a map and chunked it out and said, if you help and you help, here's who's going to get what. And so what happens is in March of 1777, the French ambassador tells Britain of this treaty, and it full-fledged causes war between France and Britain. Britain does not recognize it. They declare war against France, and it's just a hot mess. Well, when France and Britain are officially at war, this is where Spain decides it can jump in too. We've already talked about its grievances against Britain. So now you've got France and Spain allied with us. Mainly because they were scared that their trade is being disrupted. Now, they were still also scared that if America broke free, what would that mean to the Spanish colonies that are in the new world? And so the Spanish thought, all right, what we need to do is we need to work out some sort of an agreement with the Americans so that if we help them, similar to the French, we're going to get some lands too. All right, so the Spanish were very scared of losing their territory. And so basically the moral of the story is both the French and the Spanish, they hate Britain. That's part of why they're here. But they're also here because they want to have some area of control over us when the war is done. They want to make sure that they can protect their own territorial borders. And here's just like a little fancy map. I don't know if that means much to you, but I thought it was cool looking. You know, George Washington floating out in the ocean there. But you can kind of see where the British were focusing most of their attacks, this naval blockade, for example, where the French were kind of trying to jump in. And then further to the south is really where you're going to have Spain.